Welcome to DivCasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
So, when Judah Al-Harizi first got his copy of Shmuel ibn Timon's translation of the guide, he must have clocked it himself about the un-Hebraic character of the word and its clumsy diction. He was probably not completely surprised, since he undoubtedly knew the word of the Father, and must have assumed that as the Arabic proverb goes, the branch follows the root. But he would have seen that the son had written in a style that was even more rigidly Arabized than that of Judah. He could well have said to himself that this was a job that still needed to be done. When Shmuel ibn Timon first saw Al-Harizi's translation of the guide, he must have choked with rage at a man who had encroached on his territory. Ibn Timon was seen as the authorized translator. He had corresponded with and gotten guidance from Maimonides himself. Yet Al-Harizi had gone out of his way in the introduction to criticize Ibn Timon's translation as being barely intelligible. It can only have added to Ibn Timon's anger that Al-Harizi had made two helpful improvements on the guide: a glossary of unusual Hebrew words and a chapter-by-chapter summary. These both had the potential to make his version of the guide more accessible. Ibn Timon must have taken comfort in observing that Al-Harizi's glossary was actually a shoddy piece of work, and he set out to compile a glossary of his own and make it a masterpiece. The existence of two translations, the second completed within 9 years of the first, and so different from each other, presents an interesting situation that has received only cursory treatment until now, and I'm very grateful to have been invited to produce this paper because I don't think anybody has actually done such a thing before. To all intents and purposes, Ibn Timon's translation of the guide is canonical, and Al-Harizi's translation is generally discussed only as a footnote to it. I concede at the outset, for those of you who are expecting me to defend Al-Harizi's translation as the superior one in spite of everything, I concede right at the beginning that Al-Harizi's translation is philosophically less reliable than that of Ibn Timon. Fortunately, I'm not a specialist in philosophy, so that's not my affair. The purpose of this paper is to examine Al-Harizi's translation as a literary object in its own right. Comparisons with Ibn Timon's translation are unavoidable, but I would like to understand Al-Harizi's work as a phenomenon in the history of Hebrew writing and as a representative of a particular moment in Jewish culture. So some background on Al-Harizi. This is not a full biography, but just the elements that are necessary for understanding his work on the guide. He was born in Spain, undoubtedly in the Arabic-speaking part of it, probably in Toledo in 1165. His life falls into two parts. From 1165 to about 1215, he lived in Spain and Occitania. And then from 1215 to his death in 1225, he traveled in the Muslim East from Alexandria through Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. He settled in Syria and died in Aleppo. The latter part of Al-Harizi's life is better documented than the former because he recorded his travels in the East in a short first-person work in Arabic rhymed prose called Kitab al-Durra. And this account corresponds in the main with the travels that are ascribed to his protagonist in chapter 46 of the great Hebrew Makama collection, the Tafkamoni. Also from this latter period, we are extraordinarily lucky to have an entry on him from a biographical dictionary by a Muslim scholar, one Ibn Ash'ar al-Nasiri, who was Al-Harizi's contemporary and who got his information from someone who met Al-Harizi in Aleppo in 1220. So he's one of the very rare medieval Jewish writers of whom we have, true secondhand, but something like an eyewitness account. I know you want to know what Al-Harizi was actually like. He was tall, gray-haired, and beardless, eccentric in his manner, and he spoke Arabic with a Maghrebi accent, which is not surprising. He made a living in Iraq, learned from this biographical sketch, He made his living in Iraq by writing Arabic panegyrics for Muslim patrons. So he was the only Hebrew poet known to have written a significant body of poetry in Arabic, and that's relevant, I think, to his translation of the guide. And he had a vicious way of denouncing people after once having praised them. This last observation neatly complements an aspect of his personality that we recognize from his accounts of individuals that he met in his travels in chapter 46 and in his Arabic maqam. In the East, Al-Harizi completed his masterpiece, the Tahkamuni, which is a collection of 50 maqamas in rhymed Hebrew prose, the 50th maqama being really a collection of the poetry written earlier in his life. The headings to some of the poems in the 50th maqama also are relevant for the history of his translation of the guide. And the Tahkamuni is the work on which his stature rests as one of the great medieval Hebrew writers. Unfortunately, the earlier part of Al-Harizi's life, the part that is relevant to the translation, is but poorly documented. There are some clues in one version of the protagonist's travels in the Tahkamuni. There is a European itinerary that could have been Al-Harizi's own. The only other sources for his life and works in this period are the introductions to his individual works and the headings of some of the poems in chapter 50 of the Tahkamuni. During this first period, however, Al-Harizi made many translations. In Spain, he made his translation of the Arabic maqamas of Al-Harizi, which is by far the most virtuosic of his translations. And it's the work that he says provided the impetus for him to compose his own collection of maqamas, the Tahkamuni. Also in Spain, he translated Maimonides' treatise on resurrection. In Occitania, he produced a number of translations for patrons from Lunel. For Jonathan of Lunel, he translated Maimonides' commentary on Seder Zeraim of the Mishnah. According to the introduction, he did this work in Marseille in 1194-97. At some point, he translated Maimonides, the introduction to Maimonides' translation of chapter 10 of Sanhedrin, known as Perek Chelek. We don't know the circumstances of that translation. For the sages of Lunel, he also translated Maqalat al-Haditha fi Majaz al-Zakika by Moses ibn Ezra. And for Ezra ben Judah ibn Netanel, whose roots were in Boker, he translated a work known in Hebrew as Igeret HaMusar Klalit by a certain Ali, who has traditionally been thought to be Ali ibn Ridwan. Surprisingly, Al-Harizi also translated apparently the letter sent by Maimonides to Shmuel ibn Tibon in 1199, containing the answers to Ibn Tibon's questions about problems that had arisen in the course of his work on the translation of the guide. And apparently just before leaving Occitania, and therefore probably after translating the guide, he translated Adab al-Falasika by Hunayn ibn Ishaq for a person or persons whom he refers to as the sages of Lunel. About his other translations, we are less well informed. I've only mentioned the ones that give us any biographical indications. And this brings us to the translation of the guide. Unfortunately, in naming the sponsors of this work, Al-Harizi contradicts himself. In his preface to the translation, he says he did the work for the nobles and sages of Provence, Atzile Provincia Chachamea. But in the Tahkamuni, he says that he did it in Spain for a certain Joseph. Different scholars have expressed different opinions on purely a priori basis. In thinking about this question, it's well to remember that Al-Harizi dedicated the Tahkamuni to no fewer than 4 patrons, maybe 5, all of whom must have paid him for the privilege. And it's probably the likely solution to the question of who was the patron of the guide is that he was commissioned in Provence, but sold his translation to several other patrons. As to the date of the translation, obviously the earliest possible date is 1204, which is the date of Shmuel ibn Tibon's translation, the completion of that. And the latest possible date is 1213, when Ibn Tibon's Perush Milot Zarot appeared, containing its denunciation of Al-Harizi. So why a second translator, and why Al-Harizi as the translator? In his preface to the translation of the guide, Al-Harizi explains that he had been requested by the sages of Provence to translate the book into simple, clear words. For though a wise and learned man translated it before me, that translator intentionally worded the book so as to render it esoteric and recondite. Al-Harizi's remark was not a random insult. Shmuel ibn Timon's language is difficult, and difficulty was remarked on at the time. I'd like to remind you that in Shmuel ibn Timon's time, everybody wasn't familiar with Shmuel ibn Timon's diction as we are today. We've had centuries of studying this work, and we forget how very bizarre Ibn Timon's language must have appeared when it first did appear. For example, when Mayor Abu Lafia wanted to quote a passage from Ibn Timon's translation of the Treatise on Resurrection, he felt himself obliged to paraphrase it. As he says, the translator, Ibn Timon, translated from Arabic to Hebrew in a very difficult style. Nevertheless, I will copy that part of his wording that seems clear to me while changing other parts to clarify to the best of my ability the thought that the author intended to convey. The difficulty of Ibn Timon's translations consisted not in his use of rare words or overly refined diction, but in his diligent and principled adherence to Maimonides' Arabic syntax and word usage. By imitating Maimonides' Arabic so exactly, Ibn Timon had made the clear Arabic of the guide into an obscure Hebrew text, obliging the reader of that time to puzzle out every phrase. Al-Harizi himself cited the difficulty of Ibn Timon's Hebrew in explaining the origin of his own translation of the Treatise on Resurrection. He relates that when Ibn Timon's translation appeared in Spain, it was found to be so obscure that an unnamed dignitary commissioned a certain Joseph ben Joab to translate the Hebrew back into Arabic. And Al-Harizi's new translation is based on this secondary Arabic text. And as if Al-Harizi wanted to assure the reader that he was not merely slandering Ibn Timon's work in order to promote his own, he added as a supporting document the Hebrew translation of the preface to the Arabic retranslation, which included a similar appraisal of Ibn Timon's work. A hint of Maimonides' own dissatisfaction with the language of Ibn Timon's translation may be observed in his famous letter of 1199 to Ibn Timon. Here, Maimonides famously explained that a translator must not translate word for word, but must grasp the whole idea expressed by the author's words and state it afresh in the target language. Now, Maimonides' letter was a reply to one written by Shmuel ibn Timon containing questions about the text and meaning of passages in the first two books of the guide, which Shmuel had already translated and circulated. It does not seem that Maimonides had actually read Ibn Timon's work at that point, but he would surely have been able to infer Ibn Timon's method from the questions and proposed translations included in his letter. Why at this point in the project would Maimonides have felt it desirable to read Shmuel ibn Timon a lesson in the proper balance between words and ideas in translating? It seems reasonable to infer that Maimonides either was disappointed with the bit of draft translation included in the letter, or he foresaw that he would be when it eventually reached him. The praise that Maimonides lavishes on Ibn Timon in the letter does not contradict this interpretation, for the epistolary conventions of the age dictated that a letter opened with lavish eulogy. Moreover, there was nothing for Maimonides to gain by directly attacking a work that had been commissioned by his supporters in Provence at some expense, and that was already two-thirds drafted and in circulation. But he did criticize the translation by implication, and with certainty that the sophisticated readers with whom Ibn Timon could be expected to share the letter would immediately understand his meaning in advocating an approach to translation diametrically opposed to that employed by Ibn Timon, no matter what praises or criticism came wrapped in. Possibly the sages of Provence had already come to this conclusion. In a letter Maimonides sent to them around the same time as his letter to Ibn Timon, he mentions that he has finally sent them the third part of the guide, and he declines their request that he himself translate the work. It sounds very much as if, with two-thirds of the guide translated by Ibn Timon, the sponsors were still hoping to get a copy of the guide written in the clear and unforced rabbinic Hebrew of the Mishnah Torah, but Maimonides declined. In turning to Al-Harizi in hopes of getting an intelligible translation of the guide, the sages of Provence resorted to a well-known poet and an experienced translator who had already given satisfaction in translating 2 works of Maimonides, and who wrote a Hebrew that did not slavishly imitate the usages of Arabic. As for his command of the source language, besides being a native speaker, Al-Harizi must have had advanced training in the Arabic literary tradition, as we can infer from his later career as an Arabic poet in a competitive world where poets competed for jobs as panegyrists. The choice of Al-Harizi for a second try at translating the guide would have certainly been appropriate if, as I think probable, Al-Harizi had already translated Moshe ibn Ezra's Maqalat al-Sadiqa. This is a partly philosophical work that makes use of earlier philosophical texts, particularly Ibn Gabirol's Fountain of Life. Its first half is a study of anthropomorphic expressions in the Bible, similar in form and spirit to the lexicographical chapters of the guide. And though we cannot date them, Al-Harizi wrote some other works that show an interest in philosophical themes. The first chapter of the Tafkamoni, which was written late in life probably, shows the clear influence of Ibn Gabirol's great philosophical poem, Keter Malchut. Al-Harizi also composed 2 cycles of philosophical poems, or at least theological poems, one in Hebrew and one in Arabic. We can't date them. And these works themselves, in turn, show the influence of Moshe ibn Ezra's long philosophical poem, B'Shem El Asher Amar. Al-Harizi's detractors claim that Al-Harizi was ignorant of philosophy. But these examples show that he was not ignorant of the philosophical themes that had been current up to the 12th century. He was probably not au courant with Aristotelianism, but this deficiency may not have been so obvious in a world where Aristotle had not yet been completely internalized. Finally, Al-Harizi's writings and his connections show him to have been in the Maimonidean camp, at least as regards his affiliations. He supported Maimonides in the controversy instigated by Meir of Latvia, can be inferred from the fact that he translated the Epistle of Resurrection, and so forth. I'm not going to go into all the details, but we see him connected with people who are part of the Maimonidean crowd in Spain. I think I'm going to skip over some of the details here in order to get down to the translation itself. But before we get to the translation itself, there's one more step that we have to cover, and that is the reception of the translation. The first attack on the poet Al-Harizi, and as Shmuel ibn Tibon disparagingly refers to him, came from Shmuel ibn Tibon himself on the very first page of his glossary. The fact is, Ibn Tibon deprecates Al-Harizi's glossary and his chapter-by-chapter summary of the guide with a full blast of medieval invective, and one can only assume in the spirit of the Talmudic maxim, Kol Uman Sonei Ba'alei Umanito. Ibn Tibon regularly refers to these appendixes, respectively, not by their titles, but as Shar HaHavalim, the chapter of nonsense, and Shar HaNa'atzot, the chapter of blasphemy. Ibn Tibon's attack on Al-Harizi boils down to 3 large points. In translating, Al-Harizi added words and rearranged them, as if trying to interpret matter that he did not really understand himself. Whereas Ibn Tibon, fearing to distort Maimonides' esoteric meaning, did not feel worthy of altering anything. Second, Al-Harizi, in making an explanatory translation, transgressed Maimonides' adjuration not to reveal the esoteric meaning of the guide. Fortunately, he was saved from this transgression by his ignorance, which led him to obscure Maimonides' meaning instead of revealing it. And third, Al-Harizi's reputation as a master of both Hebrew and Arabic, which Ibn Tibon happily concedes, qualifies him for translating only texts whose meaning is obvious on the surface. Varim HaMuvanim, poetry, grammar, lexicography, chronicles, but he's ignorant of philosophy. Amusingly, Ibn Tibon claims that his criticism does not arise from personal hatred or jealousy, but only out of concern to warn readers away from Al-Harizi's work. What he does not do is cite a long list of passages that are full of mistakes. This deficiency was sort of partly supplied by Shenko Falakera a number of decades later in his celebrated Moreh HaMoreh. Falakera makes no bones about calling Al-Harizi a petty, fool, or naive, or even to cast aspersions on his Arabic, But his critique of the translation of the guide is not organized around Al-Harizi's translation, but around Ibn Tibbon's. Only two of the entries in Falakera's critique are actually built on Al-Harizi's Erebus. Otherwise, he cites Al-Harizi only as a secondary target alongside Ibn Tibbon. The extent of Falakera's animus against Al-Harizi's work is such that when he attacks a translation by Ibn Tibbon and provides his own translation to substitute for it, or his own explanation of the passage, he never mentions that Al-Harizi's translation is often in agreement with his own. He criticizes 46 passages in Ibn Tibbon's translation. In 19 of these, Al-Harizi's interpretation agrees with that of Falakera. But only once does Falakera give Al-Harizi the credit for being right. Had Falakera pointed out the other 18 places, he would have made Al-Harizi look better. Probably he didn't want to give ammunition to Al-Harizi's defenders, if there were any. And as for not bringing up mistakes in Al-Harizi's translation systematically, as he did with Ibn Tibbon's translation, he must have thought Al-Harizi's work too insignificant to merit a systematic critique, or perhaps by his time, Al-Harizi's translation had already become less consulted and didn't need the attention. But these negative judgments of 13th century scholars, as well as a few others that I'm not quoting now, have essentially been repeated by nearly everyone who has addressed the subject. To list them all would add nothing to the discussion. Nearly everyone takes potshots at Al-Harizi's translation, and little notice has been paid to Steinschneider's observation that Harizi's Morer often manchmal den Sinn der einzelnen Stellen genauer als die Schmuels wiedergibt, auch wo dies korrekter in Lesart folter. As Harizi's guide often gives more exact translations of individual passages than that of Shmuel, even where the latter had better readings. And other modern scholars have been less categorical in their criticism. But much as I would like to defend Al-Harizi, and though I find Falakera's criticism and those of many modern readers to be captious, I don't deny that Al-Harizi's translation contains numerous embarrassing mistakes, especially, but not only, even when it comes to philosophical matters. I accept Frankel's point, the very strong case that he made in his book about Ibn Tibbon, that above and beyond technical accuracy, Ibn Tibbon saw into the depths of the work in a way that Al-Harizi didn't. So perhaps everyone is right to say that Ibn Tibbon's translation deserved to prevail. But how did Al-Harizi actually perform? So I want to shift the discussion from the accuracy of Al-Harizi's translation to his method as a translator. And this can partly be done by studying his translation alone, but comparison with Ibn Tibbon makes his work, his principles, stand out more clearly. Studying Al-Harizi's language and comparing it with that of Ibn Tibbon has been an absorbing, even fascinating part of my preparation for this paper. I couldn't see it through all the way. It really deserves a doctoral dissertation. But I can make some well-grounded preliminary observations. And here are some of the practices that characterize Al-Harizi's work. The most consistent principle governing Al-Harizi's translation is the avoidance of Arabisms, even those whose presence in the Hebrew written by writers of his time was already very customary. This translation is largely, but by no means completely free of such common callous as the automatic use of kvar for kag, of sham for thumma, of ve'im for wa'in, or ve for fa. Al-Harizi usually avoids asyndetic relative clauses, a hallmark of Judeo-Arabic Hebrew. Instead, he usually inserts asher or shed to link relative clauses to main clauses. He also tries for a more Hebraic use of prepositions than most Hebrew writers of the age. Inna Allah ala surah insan, he translates Sheha Eloah ki ha'el yeshlo surah adam, which is smooth Hebrew, rather than Ibn Tibbon's Sheha Eloah al surah adam, which I don't think anybody could have understood until this usage became familiar. But these Arabisms were common in the Hebrew written in the Judeo-Arabic linguistic sphere. We find them even occasionally in Maimonides for all the authenticity of his language on the whole. But other calques used by Ibn Tibbon are less common in medieval Hebrew and result more from his heroic devotion to the principle of adhering to the Arabic original at all costs. Al-Harizi is versatile in finding real Hebrew equivalents for Arabic usages. Here's a tiny selection from innumerable examples, just from the very beginning of the book. Lil-Qira'a Alaya, which Ibn Timon translates as Nikrot Ofanai. Al-Harizi translates as Lilmod Etzli, straight Hebrew. Balam Azal, Ibn Timon Lo Sarti. Al-Harizi V'hayiti Docheotcha, normal Hebrew syntax. An Yaqa al-Yatim B'Arab, Lo Shetasigo Taba Mikreh, instead of Lo Shemipol Ha'emet B'Mikreh. Literal translation of Waqa'a simply diverts the reader from concentrating on the idea. Arinahum, where Ibn Timon habitually translates Islam, Al-Harizi, the Da'atam, the Einehem. But there are larger syntactic issues as well. Partitive mem constructions that are exceedingly common in Arabic are possible in Hebrew, but not nearly as widely used in ordinary Hebrew, and can easily cause confusion to an inexperienced reader. Al-Harizi generally reorganizes sentences to avoid these, whereas Ibn Timon translates them as they stand. Maimonides, Sar Adam min al-Mabadi, Ibn Timon, Haya ha'heder min ha'atchalot, Al-Harizi, Haya ha'efes echad min ha'atchalot. A Hebrew reader absolutely needs that kind of help, unless he's going to study Al-Harizi Ibn Timon's style and learn it like a new language. Arabic participles and mastars often present a problem for Hebrew readers. Al-Harizi avoids Ibn Timon's practice of translating substantivized participles verbatim, like mawane and shawazid, distractions, obstacles and distractions. And Ibn Timon these become monim, matridin. You can't tell what part of speech that is. Al-Harizi clarifies that they're being used as substantives by adding a noun. Hadvarim hamoniim, ha'inyanim hamatridin. Again, essential help for the Hebrew reader. Al-Harizi has a variety of ways of creating mastars in accordance with Hebrew usage. At-tashabbuh bihi, which Ibn Timon translates as an infinitive absolute, ha'hidamot bo, Al-Harizi puts in Hebrew as lehit mashel aboreh. I think I won't bother with all these examples. They're probably hard to follow them delivered orally. I don't want to bewilder you. But you get the idea that Al-Harizi is not doing anything unusual in modifying constructions here. He's doing what translators have generally felt was their duty to do in translating any text. In fact, what we're very grateful that Dines didn't do in his translation. He's not afraid to rearrange sentences and to provide English idioms to replace Arabic and Hebrew. And a couple of other procedures that Al-Harizi uses, besides reducing Arabisms, he translates Arabic names of individuals and groups into their Hebrew equivalents. Abu Nasr becomes Abi Yesha, Mutakallimun becomes Hamidabrin, Mu'tazila becomes Hamid Dalim. He calls Hebrew Lashon HaKodesh instead of translating Abrahamiya as Lashon Ivri. I'm not sure why he regularly calls God Haboreh. Maimonides usually has Allah, and Ibn Timon isn't afraid to use Ha'el, but even Ha'el wasn't a term that Hebrew writers customarily used before that time, and Haboreh actually does sound more Hebraic, more insider Hebraic. Al-Harizi often Hebraizes Arabic idioms, not merely by finding natural Hebrew equivalents, but by ingeniously making use of classical expressions from the biblical or rabbinic tradition. And this is really where he's at his best, and where it's a delight to read. Maimonides, Ulawah Lakab Talwihat. Ibn Timon, perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Al-Harizi, you feel that that's how Maimonides would have written it himself if he had been writing in Hebrew. An yasihha waqal bituruqihi sheta'amod ha'emet midracheha, instead of Ibn Timon's sheyit'amed lecha ha'emet midrachav. Even a simple word like kafira, No problem with Ibn Tibbon's translation of Rubin, it's perfectly good Hebrew. Al-Harizi lo yisafru merov. Just a little bit of color, a little bit of traditional language. Doesn't distort anything, but makes it readable. Al-alam be'asrihi. Ibn Tibbon, perfectly fine. Ha'olam kulo. Al-Harizi. Ha'olam ulo. We're in the world of the Psalms. Kad yachta bihim omad. Ibn Tibbon, efshar she'afsik b'hem hamavet. It's perfectly fine. But Al-Harizi, yafrid hamavet beinam uvein cheftzam. Elegant. It doesn't change anything. I feel like you're reading a book in the language of its own, of a real author, instead of the work of an intermediary. Al-Harizi often shows his skill as a polished Hebrew writer by seizing occasional opportunities even for elegance. وَتَوَجَّهْتَ إِلَى حَيْثُ تَوَجَّهْتَ. Maimonides says to the disciple, "Ufanita ala sharpanita," in Ibn Tibbon's translation, excellent Hebrew. Al-Harizi, "V'samta megamat panecha u'mechos chefzecha." Lovely. It's how Maimonides might have written himself, and so forth. Again, I give you all these examples so simply to be bewildered. And some of Al-Harizi procedures don't have so much to do with Arabic or Hebrew character, but they're simply there for the purpose of clarity, which is also very worthwhile. Al-Harizi often chooses the contextual meaning of an Arabic word instead of sticking to what was considered in his time to be the fundamental meaning of the word. For example, very simple examples, وَقَصَدْتَ in the epistle to the disciple, وَقَصَدْتَ Ibn Tibbon, v'chivanta. It's okay. I mean, he has in mind the idea of direction. It's inherent in Qasada. But in the context, uvata is much clearer. It just doesn't impede you as much. Ta'khud, where Al-Harizi means you learned. Al-Harizi translates lakachta. Well, that's lexically correct. Achava does mean to take, but it's not a contextual translation. A contextual translation, Al-Harizi is absolutely right. It means you learn. Ma'na gharib. These are all from the introduction, from the epistle. Ma'na gharib. I think that word gharib turned up yesterday in one of the examples. Ibn Tibbon translates as if from the dictionary, inyan zar. But you can't fault that. Gharib does mean zar. But Al-Harizi's got the meaning of gharib that's relevant to the context, which is mufla, inyan mufla. That's what Maimonides is getting at. Something surprising, unusual, something maybe eye-opening. Al-Harizi sometimes telescopes typically Arabic constructions into more concisely Hebrew ones. His translations are often explanatory. He will add a particle or a word or a pronoun to make something explicit that was elided in the original. He sometimes translates one word with two, a translation procedure that Maimonides himself recommended in the letter to Shmuel ibn Tibbon. And Maimonides actually even gave an example of that himself. Ibn Tibbon generally does not do that. I think there are occasional examples of Ibn Tibbon. For example, Tulu Tawti'at, Rova Hatsaot, Viha Hatlamot. To try to cover as much ground as possible, make as explicit as possible what might be implicit in the word. And Al-Harizi is not afraid to rearrange the order of elements in a sentence, and no translator should ever be afraid to rearrange the order of elements in a sentence, unless you're creating a textbook. Now, I have to retract a good deal of what I've just said, partially. I've come this far and told you that Al-Harizi created a Hebrew guide to the perplexed. Wait a minute. Now that we've cataloged some of the techniques by which he created a more Hebrew-sounding version of the guide, we have to face the fact that Al-Harizi's translation is not devoid of Arabisms. Some of these were inherited features of the language that I mentioned at the beginning. Al-Harizi slips naturally into all of these tics of Judeo-Arabic writers. He does occasionally use kvar for qad. He does say sham for fama. He does say what in for fa, for what in. He does say wa for fa. He does occasionally forget to add a share to a relative clause. And like most writers of his age, he regularly uses zahar in the sense of to mention or to say, like zakara in Arabic. But other Arabisms reflect exactly the kind of slavish reproduction of Maimonides' Arabic that we associate with Ibn Tibon. Al-Harizi usually places demonstratives before the noun, zeh sefer, which is an Arabism. Like Ibn Tibon, Al-Harizi often uses prepositions in the Arabic manner. L'rov ahavatcha, because of your great love. L'tuv sikvacha, on account of your excellent mind. L'dati, because I knew. Like Ibn Tibon, Al-Harizi does rely on constructions using the partitive men that are not normal in biblical or rabbinic. Mashalim and shalim, some parallel. Masharati b'shirecha meiro v'tishukah, the great desire that I detected in your poems, and so forth. Al-Harizi occasionally writes a hal clause in the Arabic manner. To go back to that phrase I quoted before partly, Yafrid hamavet beinam u'bein cheftzam v'odam lomdim b'ktzat ha'tzaot. Death separates them from their goal while they are still in the process of learning some of the preliminaries. Various Arabic idioms are found quite often in Al-Harizi's translation as kafs. Al-pi mashahim alav, in accordance with the way they actually are, something that he generally avoids doing these things, but they do slip in. Shurim k'tzatam bi-k'tzatam, pure Arabic, connected one to the other. Tashuv chachmatam sikhrut, their apprehension turns into incapacity. I mean, the translators, beware, your native language is always going to come up and haunt you unless you get a native reader to edit your work. And one thing that may seem like a minor point, but it keeps bothering me, and that is, the guide is full of quotations from the Bible, and Maimonides introduces them in the Arabic manner by saying qala, or qawlihi, and Ibn Tibon naturally translates that as amar. If your policy was to Hebraize the book, nothing would have been easier than to say Kamash Ne'emar or Kakatuv or Shene'emar. I mean, that's how those who were brought up in the Hebrew reading tradition would automatically say those things. But that's not Al-Harizi's practice. He sometimes says Kasher Ne'emar, which is perfectly good Hebrew, though not traditional. But he often uses Ve'omro, a Mastar-like construction, distinctly a calc. So he didn't do a perfect job of eliminating Arabisms from the Hebrew guide. In fact, his translation contains some sentences that are not so different from the style of Ibn Tibon. His translation is not densely packed with Arabisms, but those that remain are a puzzle. As an original Hebrew writer, he was famous for his virtuosic Hebrew style. You'd think that if anybody would be a biblical purist, it would be he. In fact, Al-Harizi's translation of the guide seems to me to be not as free of Arabisms as are his other translations. The realization that Al-Harizi's translation of the introduction to the Mishnah sounds a lot like Maimonides' own Hebrew led me to examine 4 of Al-Harizi's other translations of prose works and to compare them with his translation of the guide. The works I chose were Musarei HaPhilosophim, Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah, the 13 Principles from Maimonides' introduction to Perek Chedek, and Moses Ibn Ezra's Makalah al-Tzadikah. I focused on syntax and idioms rather than vocabulary, because some subject matters might dictate a higher density of words of Arabic origin, and others might dictate a lower density. I tallied the occurrence of the most common Arabisms found in the Hebrew of the period in the first 1,000 words of these 4 works. I know it's a very small sample, and some of the variation is due to chance. So this is only touching on the subject. But with all due reservations, here's the tally. In Musarei HaPhilosophim, I found 22 Arabisms. In the introduction to the Mishnah, 7. The 13 articles of the Creed, 12. In the Chadikah, we jump up to 26. But in the guide, in the epistle, the first 1,000 words, the epistle and the introduction, 40. So the surprise here is the big jump in the number of Arabisms in Al-Harizi's translation compared to his translation of other works. If these statistics were to be confirmed by a study of a larger sample, they would demonstrate conclusively that in translating the guide, Al-Harizi clung more closely to the language of the source text than he did in his other translations. So what held him back from purifying his language in the translation of the guide? Was he inhibited from taking complete freedom by the authority already enjoyed by Ibn Tibbon? By his own feelings of inadequacy in dealing with philosophical material? Or did he simply work too quickly and not take the trouble to revise his translation? Another possibility needs to be considered, and that is perhaps Al-Harizi did not work completely independently of Ibn Tibbon. I've come to imagine that he kept Ibn Tibbon before him as well as the Arabic original, and that while he sometimes translated directly from the Arabic and produced his own version, at other times he simply adapted Ibn Tibbon's translation, modifying words and phrases in accordance with his commission to make the Hebrew read more like Hebrew. This picture of his procedure might explain the inconsistency of the outcome. I have some passages to compare, and I originally intended to distribute them in the form of a handout, but there were difficulties getting it reproduced. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of why you don't have a handout in front of you. It's going to be hard. Let me read you one example, one very, very tiny example out of the several that I copied out here. There are many more could be produced. The shortest example that I have is where Al-Harizi writes, Hine yadata imratam hakolelet l'minei hasarot kulam hatluyot b'zeh ha'inyan. Ibn Tibbon, Kvar yadata imratam hakolelet l'minei ha'perushim kulam hatluyim b'zeh ha'inyan. They're virtually the same words. I know it's a short sentence, and you ask how else could it have been translated? What else could a translator say? I tried my hand at it, pretending that I was living in the 12th century, and I wrote, Harea tayodea imratama kolelet et kol minei ha'perushim hatluyim b'davar hazeh. I mean, there are other ways you could go about doing such a thing. I'm not saying mine is the right way, but I am saying that I would have expected more variation in all of the examples that I have in front of me. What's another short one? Well, I think we'll just move on. In these passages, the formulation is suspiciously similar, except that certain words and grammatical patterns in which Ibn Tibbon mimics the Arabic are replaced by Al-Harizi in his habitual ways, as if he were copying Ibn Tibbon's translations, Hebraizing as he went, but not actually recasting the sentence, as one would do if one were working directly from Arabic. The possibility that Al-Harizi did not translate independently, but merely reworded Ibn Tibbon's translation, was raised by Zona in an article published in 1938-39. As a result of his work with Maimonides' letter to Ibn Tibbon, Zona came to believe that the Hebrew translation of this text is the work of Ibn Tibbon as revised by Al-Harizi, and he appears to have extended this conclusion to Al-Harizi's translation of the guide itself. He didn't present this view as a certain conclusion, but he did suggest that the sages of Lunel commissioned Al-Harizi not to translate the guide from scratch, but to revise Ibn Tibbon's translation, and he called for further study of the relationship between the two translations to see if this conjecture can be sustained. I did not know of Zona's conjecture when I began working on this paper, but it appears that in preparing to write it, I actually began a research project to which Zona summoned his readers. Like him, I'm not claiming certainty, but I think that there are ample grounds to make a full-fledged study of the matter. If this turns out to be correct, it would explain why Al-Harizi's translation of the guide is so different in style from his other translations. It remains to consider the cultural background of the two translators and the differing outlooks that underlie the two different projects. Al-Harizi was a product of Judeo-Arabic culture, which was still alive in the Spain in which he was formed, though it was changing under the impact of Christian Romance culture and was foreseeably in decline. It wasn't only the Arabic language that Al-Harizi learned as a child. He absorbed the values of the Judeo-Arabic Golden Age and considered himself an heir of the great Hebrew poets. In the world to which he looked back, language and style were valued in themselves. The ideal intellectual was an adib, a cultured man, at home in both languages, who had a hand in poetry, knew the Bible, had a grasp of rabbinic texts, could write Hebrew in accordance with the ideal of Tzachot, and was well informed about the kind of things a cultured Muslim knew. An adib did not necessarily have professional knowledge of medicine, diplomacy, business, religious law, or philosophy, but he would have had a smattering of knowledge in all of these areas. His mastery was of the literary tradition and of the language. Such a person could earn a living by writing poetry, formal correspondence, and official documents. Conversely, a doctor, a diplomat, a businessman, a rabbi, or a philosopher might have a taste for poetry and might, from time to time, try his hand at writing verses. Ibn Tibon was a provençal, despite his family origins in Andalus. His father had trained him in Arabic and made sure that he got a first-class education in Judaica, philosophy, and science. Reasonable to speculate that he grew up in a circle of Andalusi expats, among whom he absorbed the language and attitudes of the immigrant generation. But he used the skills so acquired in the service of a community that had different intellectual ideals, and one in which literary skills were of secondary value, one in which intellectual life was more simply grounded in the rabbinic tradition. Philosophical and scientific materials had begun to reach these communities in the 12th century, especially in the wake of the Almohade conquest of southern Al-Andalus that had brought his father and other Andalusi intellectuals to Provence. Such men were able to make careers disseminating their knowledge of Hebrew grammar and lexicography, biblical studies, scientific material, and philosophy by writing original books and commentaries and translating Arabic books into Hebrew. But the Arabic intellectual and social infrastructure that generated literary productivity in Al-Andalus was not present in Provence, driving the Jewish Jewry to the kind of literary production that had flourished in Al-Andalus. The type of the adib and his typical form of expression, non-liturgical poetry, were slow to develop in Occitania. Nor did the nascent literature in Provençal vernacular stimulate the Jews to parallel literary creativity as had Arabic in 10th century Spain. To the extent that the Arabic literary model was imported to Occitania along with philosophy and science, it did not strike deep roots. The first major poet of the region, Yitzhak Hasniri, was active in the first quarter of the 13th century. There were some poets, but there was not the craze for poetry that had overtaken Jewish Spain in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. The differences between the translations of Ibn Tibon and Al-Harizi reflect the different attitudes of their two communities towards scholarship and language in general. Shmuel Ibn Tibon's father, Judah, though a product of Al-Andalus, and though capable of writing beautiful Hebrew, as shown by his ethical will, adopted a driving functional attitude toward language. In the preface to his translation of Chovot al-Lavot, Judah expresses his admiration for Arabic and declares its superiority over Hebrew. Even if his acceptance of the superiority of Arabic has in view only its superiority for scientific and philosophical purposes, it is unimaginable in the writings of Al-Harizi, in whose work the superiority of Hebrew is vigorously asserted. Al-Harizi's view of the superiority of Hebrew for all purposes is expressed in the introduction in the first chapter of the Tachmoni, and it's the full-blown expression of the ideal view of the Hebrew language, adumbrated already in the introduction to Sadia Gaon's Agaron and implicit in the whole history of the Golden Age. Shmuel Ibn Tibon, determined to convey Maimonides' meaning in a form as close to Maimonides' words as humanly possible, was ruthless in using Hebrew in a purely functional manner. For Al-Harizi, this was not a respectable approach. His guiding principle was tzachot, grammatical and lexical accuracy in accordance with the norms of biblical Hebrew as it was understood and used by the poets of the Golden Age. Though he did not pursue this principle to consistency, this essentially conservative approach guided his work on the translation, contrasting with the more innovative approach of Ibn Tibon. In philosophy, too, we have seen that Al-Harizi represents the older Judeo-Arabic tradition, for there is no evidence that he was himself touched by the new Aristotelianism. In the philosophical errors in the translation of the guide, his detractors found much evidence to that effect. All the philosophical material in the Tachmoni and his religious poems in Hebrew and Arabic, and his most important translation projects, other than the guide, were, as we have seen, of the good old-fashioned Neoplatonic type that had provided the theoretical background for so much Golden Age writing. Al-Harizi probably never really felt at home in Provence, in a world where, other than as a translator, there was no natural place for a Judeo-Arabic man of letters. So he went east, to places where Arabic culture wasn't threatened. There, despite his bitter complaints about the ineptness of the Hebrew writers and the stinginess of the grandees, he did find no fewer than 4 patrons to whom he could dedicate the Tachkemoni. And even if his Hebrew did not find the reception he had hoped for in Iraq, at least his Arabic was in demand in a world that knew how to value it. So it came about that this champion of the Hebrew language in all its biblical purity ended his days as an Arabic poet writing panegyrics for Muslim grandees. It may be my fancy, but I can't help reading the 3rd chapter of the Tachkemoni as a literary mirror of the peculiar cultural moment that is represented by Al-Harizi's career. The narrator attends a party, presumably in Iraq, where people are discussing literature. Among them is an old man, fat, ugly, uncouth. He doesn't take part in the conversation. He just grabs food from every side and crams it into himself. The narrator and the others are disgusted at his manners. At last, this presumed parasite stops eating and addresses the group. "What are you talking about?" he asks. They reply that they have been discussing the great Hebrew poets of Spain, and they said this and that about Shlomo Nabi and Judah Halevi and the others. "Fools," he exclaims. "None of you know what you're talking about. This is my subject. Here is the truth." And then he launches into a discourse that displays not only his erudition and literary judgment, but also his eloquence in the delivery, astonishing everyone present. And having completed his discourse, he vanishes, leaving them all astonished at the amazing contradiction between his literary skills and his revolting appearance and behavior. The narrator realizes that the old man is his friend, the versatile and witty Cheber Hakimi, whom he has encountered before and will encounter in every following chapter of the Tachkemoni. I can't help feeling that this old man is none other than Al-Harizi himself, an outsider in Iraq who sees himself as a master of the literary tradition in a world that admires it but doesn't really know it. Here's the beginning of the old man's speech. The poets you have been speaking of, and whose significance you have been examining, I was summoned to their wars. I am just now returned from the battle. My heart is the scroll of their affairs, and I am the record book of their poems. Lend your ears to me. The speaker presents himself not as a mere student of the great poets of Spain, not as a mere observer, but as one of them, a refugee from their own world. Thus the speaker in the Tachkemoni represents himself as the last one standing after the dissolution of Judeo-Arabic culture in Spain, a poignant image of a creature rendered grotesque by cultural dislocation. Al-Harizi's translation of Maimonides' God, I think, was done in this conservative spirit. In its only partly successful attempt to turn Maimonides' Arabic into idiomatic Hebrew, it is as much a product of the Judeo-Arabic world as the guide itself. Though Ibn Tibone's translation adheres slavishly to Maimonides' Arabic, it is a free translation in the larger sense, that it is free of Judeo-Arabic literary ideals, and looks forward instead to the new Jewish culture of Occitania, Christian Spain, and Italy. Thank you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.